Hello guys, welcome back to my study vlog. Today we'll cover the important topic of world history, that is Roman Empire. This is the most important topic of the world history which should be known, and what from when the Roman Empire is at its peaks. When Roman Empire divided into eastern and western halves, and Roman Empire invaded by tribes for North and Central Europe. All we're going to discuss in this chapter. So here is the map of the stretch of the territory that included most of the Europe as we know it today, and a large part of the fertile Crescent and North Africa. In this chapter, we'll look at the way this empire were all organized, and the political forces that shaped its destiny, and the social group into which people were divided. So we'll also see the wealth of local culture and languages, that women had a stronger legal position than they do in many countries today. So yes, let's start. He says that you can watch my full video on my YouTube channel. Here I'm going to cover the little bit of this page. Two powerful empires ruled over most of the Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East in the period between the birth of Christ, and the early part of the 7th century. Let's say down in 630. Two empires were those of Rome and Iran. The Romans and Iranians were rivals and fought against each other for most of their history. Their empires lay next to each other, separated only by the narrow strip of land that ran along a river, Euphrates. In this chapter, we'll start looking at the Roman Empire, but we'll also refer in passing to Romans' rival, Iran. If you look at the map, you will see that continents of Europe and the Africa are separated by a sea that stretches all from Spain in west to Syria in the east. This sea is called Mediterranean Sea, it says, and it was the heart of Rome's empire. And Rome dominated the Mediterranean Sea. All the religions around the sea in both directions, north of south. Boundaries of the empire were formed by two great rivers, that is Rhine and the Danube to the south, by the huge expanse of desert called Sahara. The vast stretch of territory was the Roman Empire, and Iran controlled the whole area south of the Caspian Sea and eastern Arabia. Okay, and the sometime last part of the Afghanistan as well. These two superpowers have divided most of the world. China is called Taqin, the Great China, through the west. And you see the early empires. Roman Empire can broadly be divided into two phases: early and late. Divided by the 3rd century is a part of historical watershed between them. In other words, the whole period down the main part of the 3rd century can be called early empire. The period after that is late empire. So we know the difference between the early empire and the late empire. A major difference between the two superpowers and their respective empires was the Roman Empire was culturally much more diverse than that of Iran. Parthians and the late Sasanians, the dynasties ruled Iran in this period, ruled over a population that was mainly Iranian. The Roman Empire, by contrast, was a mosaic of territories and culture that were chiefly bound together by a common system of government. Many languages were spoken in the empire, but for the purpose administration. Latin and Greek were the most widely used in the only languages, Latin and Greek. The upper classes of the East spoken and wrote in Greek, and those of the West in Latin, and boundary between these broad languages are ran somewhere across the middle of the Mediterranean, between the African province of Tripolitania, while Latin speaking, and Cyrenaica, Greek speaking. All these who lived in the empire were subject to a single ruler, the emperor, regardless of where they lived and what language they spoke. The regime established by Augustus, the first emperor, 27 BC, was called the Principate. Although Augustus was the sole ruler, the only real source of authority, the fiction was kept alive. He was actually only leading citizen, precepts of Latin, not the absolute ruler. This was the note of the respect for Senate, the body which had control earlier in the days when it was republic. The Senate had existed in Rome for centuries and remains a body representing the aristocracy, that is, wealthiest families of the Roman and later Italian descent, mainly landowners. Most of the Roman histories that survive in Greek and Latin were written by people from the senatorial background. Okay. From this, it is clear emperors were judged by how many behaved towards Senate. The worst emperors were those who were hostile to the senatorial class, behaving with suspicion or brutality and violence. Many senators earned to go back to these days of republic. Most of them have realized that this was impossible. Okay. The next to the emperor and the senate, and the other key institution of the imperial rule was the army. Unlike the army of this rival in the Persian Empire, which was conspired, army and Romans had paid professional army where soldiers had to put in minimum of 25 years of service, and that the existence of paid army was a distinctive feature service of the Roman Empire. The army was the largest single organized body in the empire by the 4th century, and it actually had the power to determine the fate of emperors. The soldiers would constantly agitate for better wages and service conditions. These agitations often look the form of mutiny. If the soldiers fell down like their generals, even the emperor. Again, our picture of the Roman army depends largely on the way they were portrayed by the historians with these senatorial sympathies. The Senate hated and feared the army because it was a source of often unpredictable violence, especially in the tense condition of 3rd century, when government was forced to tax more heavily to pay for its mounting military expenditures. Okay. To sum up, emperor, the aristocracy, and the army were three main players in the political history of empire. The success individual emperors depended on their control of the army, and when the empires were divided, the result usually was civil war, except for one notorious year, 69 CE, when 4 emperors mounted the throne in quick succession. The first 2 centuries were, on the whole free from civil war, and in this sense, relatively stable. Succession in the throne was based on, as far as possible, on family descent, either natural or adoptive, and even the army was strongly wedded to this principle. For example, Tiberius, the second in the long line of Roman emperors, was not the natural son of Augustus, the ruler who founded the Principate, but Augustus after him ensured a smooth transition. External warfare was also much less common in the first 2 centuries. The empire inherited by the Tiberius from Augustus was already so vast that further expansion was felt to be unnecessary. In fact, the Augustus age remembered for peace. It resulted in, after decades of internal strife and centuries of military conquest, the only major campaign of expansion in the early empire was Trajan's fruitless occupation of territory across the Euphrates in the year 113 the 17th sea abandoned by the successors. So what I found important, I used to mark it. And much more characteristics was gradual extension of Roman direct rule. This was accompanied by absorbing a whole series of dependent kingdom into Roman provincial territory. The Near East was full of such kingdoms, but by the early 2nd century, those which lay west to Euphrates towards Roman territory had disappeared, swallowed by the Rome. Incidentally, some of these kingdoms were extremely wealthy, and for example, Herod's kingdom yielded the equivalent of 5.4 million denarii per year, equal to 125,000 kg of gold. The denarius was a Roman silver coin containing 4.5 grams of pure silver. Now this comes important part. In fact, except for Italy, which was not considered a province in this century, all the territories of the empire were organized into provinces and subject to taxation. At its peak in the 2nd century, the Roman Empire stretched from Scotland to border of the Armenia, and from the Sahara to the Euphrates and sometimes beyond. Given that there was no government in the modern sense to help them in run things, you may well ask, how was it possible for the emperor to cope with the control and administration of such vast and diverse set of territories with a population of some 60 million in the mid-2nd century? The answer lies in the urbanization of the empire. The great urban centers that lined shores of the Mediterranean, Carthage, Alexandria, Antioch, were the biggest among them, were the true bedrock of the imperial system. It was through the cities of government was unable to tax the provincial countryside, which generated much of the wealth of the empire. What this means that the local upper classes actively collaborated with the Roman state in the administrative their own territories and raising taxations from them. In fact, one of the most interesting aspects of Roman, this line should be marked, history in the dramatic shift in power between Italy and the province. Throughout the 2nd and the 3rd century, it was the province upper classes who supplied most of the cadre that governed the provinces and commanded the armies. They came to form a new elite administrators and military commanders who became much more powerful than the senatorial class because they had the backing of the emperor. As this new group emerged, the Emperor Gallienus consolidated their rise to the power by excluding senators from military command. We are told that Gallienus forbade his senators from serving in the army or being access to it in order to prevent control of the empire from falling into their hands. This comes the important part, power of excluding senators from military command. Yes. Okay. Now, next to sum up to the late first, second and early centuries are the army and administration irrecoverably down the provinces. The citizens who spread to this religion was no longer confined to Italy, but individuals of Italian origin continued to dominate this Senate at least till 3rd century, and when senators of provincial origin became a majority. These trends reflected the general decline of the Italy within the empire, both political and economic, and the rise of new elites in the wealthier and more urbanized parts of the Mediterranean, such as south of Spain, Africa, and the East. The city of Roman sense was an urban center with its sound magistrates, city council, and a territory containing villages which were under its jurisdiction. Thus, one city could not be in the territory of another city, but villages almost always were. Villages could be upgraded to the status of cities and vice versa, usually as a mark of the imperial favor for the opposite One crucial advantage of the living in the city was simply that it might be better provided for during food shortage and even famines than countryside. And public baths were strike features of Roman urban life. When Iranian ruler tried to introduce them into Iran, he encountered the wrath of clergy there, and water was sacred and wanted to use it for public bathing may seem a discretion up to them. Urban population also enjoyed a much higher level of entertainment. For example, one calendar tells us that specula shows filled no less than 176 days of year. Okay. Now there arises a crisis which is called the 3rd century crisis. The 1st and the 2nd centuries were by the large period of peace, prosperity and economic expansion. The 3rd century brought the first major sign of internal strength. From the 230s, the empire found itself fighting on several fronts simultaneously. In Iran, a new and more aggressive dynasty emerged in 225. They called themselves the Sasanians, and within 15 years expanded rapidly in the direction of Euphrates. In famous rock inscription cut in the language, Shapur first, the Iranian ruler, claimed he had annihilated a Roman army, even captured the eastern part of Antioch. Meanwhile, a whole series of Germanic tribes or rather tribal confederacies, most notably Alemanni, the Franks and the Goths, began to move against Rhine and the Danube frontiers. The whole period from 233 to 280 saw repeated invasions of whole line of the province that stretched from Black Sea to the Alps and southern Germany. The Romans were forced to abandon much of the territory beyond the Danube, and the emperor of this period was constantly in the field against that of the Romans and barbarians. The rapid succession of the emperor's 3rd century, 47 years, is obvious symptoms of strain faced by empire in this period. Now we'll talk general literacy and culture. Maybe in the next slot I'm going to cover the rest of the topics, and it come to an end after 4 to 5 pages. So yes, now I'll move on to the Islamic lands, but before that we need to cover these 4-5 pages in slot number 2. So bye bye, good night, have a great day ahead tomorrow.